There we go. All right, welcome everybody to the November meeting. We had quite a few people RSVP and then say time change or something else happened, going to the library talk. So a lot of people we might have a smaller crowd today, but a lot of people were looking forward to watching the video afterwards. So, which is always nice to know, okay? So just as we always start off, a couple of announcements, and then we will go into Tom's talk on a scandal in Serbia. As always, Tom does a fantastic job, especially with the history, and then we'll have a nice discussion at the end, okay? So that's kind of the beginning here, or the format for today. For announcements, I'm going to start positive and then we're going to get negative for a little bit. But first of all, delighted to say that the weekend events for 2022 are going to be in person, okay? So the Sherlock Holmes Society of London annual dinner on January 8th is happening, and it is happening in London. And then also there's an event on January 9th. So those of you who are traveling to the UK or live in the UK, it's on, okay? Also, BSI weekend is in person, January 12th through the 16th. I know that sounds like a long weekend, but they have events Wednesday through Sunday. And if you happen to be there on Saturday, January 15th from 9 a.m. to noon is the Merchants Room. And Brian and I will be there with a table for Belanger Books. So if you are there, we would love for you to stop by and say hello, introduce yourselves. It would be great to meet. It's always so awesome to meet the 5 Miles members in person, especially since we're all global, okay? Hello there, Sandy.
Hi.
Hi, welcome.
Thank you for inviting me.
Of course. And you are always welcome to join us. This is an international group, and we welcome people from all over the world for each of our meetings. And we will always be virtual just to make it so everybody can always attend. So even though everything's going back to in person, we're still online. All right.
That's good for those of us who don't like to do a lot of traveling.
You got it. That's my thought as well. Also right now, 11 to 2 today is the Sherlock Holmes at the Pratt Library event. But since you are with us, you can watch the recording on YouTube at a later date because they did have 8 fantastic speakers. Alan Reddig, Dan Thomas, Lynn Stevens, you can see the list, Ross Davies, Denny Dobry. I mean, it's a great list. They're going to talk all in the canon. But the awesome thing is that the Enoch Pratt Library has its own website. And so you are welcome to go back afterwards, go to their YouTube channel and watch it. This event will also be on a YouTube channel, as I said at the beginning here. A number of people contacted me saying they couldn't be here, but they're really looking forward to watching it after. Okay. All right. Well, that was all like the positive, but I did want to say we had a couple of big losses in the Sherlockian community since last we met. And just to honor them, oh, whoops, one more thing, sorry. I forgot to put this in there too, that Belanger Books, we do our annual Veterans Day fundraiser for the Fisher House, which helps military families. So if you want, on Veterans Day, we give a bunch of free Sherlock Holmes ebooks will be on Amazon, and we'll do a sale for some of our paperbacks and hardcovers, but there'll be more about that. You'll see, I'll put a blog post out and have that out on Thursday. Okay, so it's Veterans Day in America, by the way. So Thursday, probably into Friday, will be the sale and also some free Sherlock Holmes books. Okay, so really did want to take a couple moments though to just say we did lose some heavy hitters in October. Huge loss here from Wiggins, the second longest Wiggins for the BSI. Michael Whalen, who also started the BSI Trust. And, you know, I had, Brian and I got to meet him just one time at the first BSI weekend we went to, and he was an absolute gentleman. And this was a huge loss. And there's an excellent article on I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere that recounts just everything that this man did for the Holmes community, and I highly recommend reading it. On a more personal note, one of my good friends, Mark Levy, who's also BSI, part of my Dr. Watson's Neglected Patients group in Colorado, in Denver, also just passed away on October 30th. I actually am getting a little choked up just talking about him. He was a great guy. Nominated me, and I actually won the Beacon Award for excellence in Sherlock Holmes teaching. And I just can't say enough about him. It's hard even to look at him, but he was a great man, really, really friendly. I'm good. I just saw him at my house a couple months back. He brought me a copy of the Solar Ponds Omnibus from his library, and we chatted for a bit. And that was the last time I saw him, but is going to be greatly missed. All right, and lastly, which is a really good segue into Tom's talk, we also lost Carol Nelson Douglas, who probably was the most famous author of Irene Adler fiction. Goodnight, Mr. Holmes was a New York Times notable book of the year. I believe as the series was a bestseller. And she wrote, if you get a chance to read some of her fiction, I highly recommend when we're done. If you haven't yet, seek it out. She wrote a number of stories for the MX anthology as well. And she also had a piece with Irene Adler in Sherlock Holmes of Baking Street, which Belanger Books published earlier this year. And really cool author. What I like about it is she put Irene Adler front and center. Holmes was on the side, and Irene Adler even has an assistant she works with, and it's a really cool series. So if you haven't read it, I highly recommend ordering a copy, at least this first book, and you'll really enjoy it. All right, just gonna take a quick look in the chat. Oh, looks like some people had some connection problems. Looks like it got fixed though. Excellent. Okay, cool. All right, so next, so Tom Turley. I can't say enough good things about him. This guy's great. So Tom Turley has been hooked on Holmes since about the age of 12. He has on his biography on Amazon. He has a PhD in British history, but spent most of his career as an archivist with the state of Alabama. You'll notice that when you hear his accent when he talks. He's approaching, it said, when he was approaching retirement, Tom returned to his youthful hobby of writing fiction. His pastiche, Sherlock Holmes, eventually tainted. His pastiche, Sherlock Holmes, eventually tainted canister, is available as an ebook and audiobook from MX Publishing. It was also published in the Art of Sherlock Holmes USA edition 1 with a painting by artist Angela Fegan. Previously, Thomas had stories published in parts 6, 7, 18, 19, 27 of the MX Book of New Sherlock Holmes stories. One of them, A Ghost from Christmas Past, also appeared in the Art of Sherlock Holmes. And we actually had that as one of our meetings last year, which is an excellent one. If you want to know about Watson's time in America, I highly recommend going back and watching the recording of that one. His new collection of historical pastiches is right there, Sherlock Holmes and the Crowned Heads of Europe. It includes 4 interrelated stories that involve Holmes and Watson in the events that led to World War I. And Tom lives with his wife, Paula, along with 2 new dogs in Montgomery, Alabama. And again, you can contact him after we're done through MX Publishing, his Goodreads, his Amazon author pages. And Tom's great. He's awesome to correspond with. So if you have any questions for him after the talk we don't get to today, absolutely seek him out, and he will be happy to go back and forth. All right. So round of applause for Tom here. I'm going to stop sharing for a second to get the PowerPoint ready here. Excellent. Yay, Tom.
Thank you, Derek.
Okay, one sec, and we'll get the PowerPoint up here. There you go. They go to the front, and I will present.
All right.
There you go. You are on.
Okay. Now, do I click it or do you click it?
I think I'm clicking it. Unless you wanted me to share your screen, then you can. It's up to you, man.
Oh, no, that's okay. I'll just tell you when to move then.
Okay.
Thank you, Derek, for that very nice introduction, and thank you all for attending today. My story is, as you heard, a scandal in Serbia. And actually, this was published several years ago in the MX anthology that Derek referred to. So some of you may have seen it previously, but as you can tell by the title page here, it does focus very heavily on Irene Adler. So let's go on. Next slide.
Oh, hold on one sec.
Okay.
There it goes. There it goes.
All right. Well, as Derek said, Crowned Heads is actually a collection of 4 historical pastiches that involve Holmes and Watson with European royalty in the events that lead up to World War I. The other stories are considerably longer and have really more historical content, and that the royal figures actually appear in the stories rather than being murdered before Holmes and Watson get there. So if you enjoyed this one, from a historical perspective, regardless of what you think about the Irene Adler angle, the other stories do have, more historical interest, I think, than this one does. Okay. Just briefly to go through the events of the story. Alexander Obrenović, thank God I only have to say that once, Serbia's young king and his consort Queen Draga were very much hated in Serbia because of their Austrian connections and the legacy left by Alexander's father, who we'll talk about in a minute. But their murder in 1903 really changed the political dynamics of the Balkans, because prior to that time, Serbia had been more or less under Austrian domination, and under the new dynasty, the Karađorđevics and King Peter, they began actively trying to foment trouble in the Austro-Hungarian Empire and recover Bosnia and Herzegovina. And of course, some of that ultimately led to the Sarajevo assassination, and several of the officers who were involved in the May coup against Alexander and Draga also were involved in the Sarajevo plot later on. Now, when this story first came out, at least one person who read the MX anthology kind of singled it out for a bad review and an otherwise good review of the collection. And even though I wasn't real happy about that, I can certainly understand most of the points that he made in the review. He didn't like the fact that Holmes and Watson had to shuttle all over Europe to get to the scene of the action. And then when they get there, basically everything's already happened. Alexander and Draga are in the condition that you see them there, and there's really not a whole lot for Holmes and Watson to do as far as solving the case. Well, I actually wrote back to this fella and warned him, that he maybe better not read the other stories either, because they all have inconclusive endings to some extent, in the sense that Holmes and Watson and the Crowned Head stories, which run all the way from 1888 up to 1913, are ultimately unable to change history. And World War I still takes place, and all they're able to do ultimately is sort of save Britain from being overwhelmed in the beginning because of von Bork's plotting by feeding the Germans false information. So from that perspective, maybe the story really isn't that successful. but the part that, Derek, I think you can go on when you're ready. The part that really I think we'll discuss more today is the Sherlockian angle and the whole business with Irene Adler. I think this should arouse a little interest and controversy. Now, of course, those of you who may be canonical purists, as this really dates me going all the way back to Laugh-In and Lily Tomlin, I guess, but I used her to sort of represent the canonical purists who might think that all this Irene Adler stuff is heretical. But one point that Watson makes at the beginning of Crowned Heads in the introduction is that a lot of the canonical cases were written as Roman à clef, at least those that had to do with politics and diplomacy, because he had to disguise the identities of eminent statesmen, diplomats, royalty, and anybody else of importance, to protect their identities. And he explains that in this blue paragraph that I've highlighted here. And some, I think one thing that some Sherlockian scholars has done is to try to figure out who these people are. And I have my own ideas about that, as we'll see. But by the time he wrote the Crowned Head stories in the late 1920s, World War I was over, the worst had happened. Most of the Victorian statesmen were either dead or retired. And so at this point, Watson could be open about the identities of the people who were involved in the Crowned Head stories. The only one he might have been likely to offend was Kaiser Wilhelm, and certainly nobody cared about offending him at that point. So moving on then. Just as an example, the two statesmen in the second stain, at least according to me, are actually the Marquis of Salisbury, who was prime minister several times between the 1880s and 1902 when he retired. And then his successor as prime minister was Arthur Balfour, who, just as in the second stain story, is the nephew of the prime minister. But now let's move on to the main event. The scandal in Serbia. How did a scandal in Bohemia become a scandal in Serbia? As the canonical king of Bohemia says here, what the hell am I doing in Serbia? And that is because for several reasons, I've actually identified the king, the true character, as being King Milan of Serbia. He couldn't have been the king of Bohemia at that time. And we can go on, Derek. Because Bohemia had not been an independent country for about 400 years, and its title had passed to the Austro-Hungarian Emperor, Franz Joseph. At that time, he certainly was not a young man out catting around. He had been married for 40 years to the Empress Sissi, Elizabeth, the beautiful, legendary empress, who appears in another of the Crowned Head stories. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that Franz Joseph had always been faithful to her, but he was not the person, he was the real king of Bohemia, and that he actually held the title, but he definitely would not have been the person that Watson intended to identify in this story. But if in that case, why, necessarily disguise the identity of the king of Serbia? Serbia was not a truly important country. King Milan was known to be kind of an international playboy. He had a number of affairs, and he certainly was no Vlad the Impaler, somebody that was likely to murder Watson or Holmes, because they had written this slightly scandalous story about him. But just a little more about King Milan, who really is a much more interesting character than his son Alexander, if we can go on. Derek, sorry. He ruled in Serbia for about 20 years. The whole reign was one long mess of wars, rebellions. As it says here, he actually at one time fell into an outdoor toilet. This may have been an assassination attempt, which kind of lets you know what a lot of the Serbs thought of King Milan, what a way to go. But He was married to a very beautiful but very pious wife. The two of them never got along. They squabbled over bringing up their son, Alexander, who you see there as a young boy. And it was just a very difficult reign. And therefore, Milan spent a lot of his time away from Serbia, running up debts, which allowed the Austrians to kind of get a financial hold over him and kind of keep Serbia under Austria's thumb, and having a lot of love affairs. And at least in my story, one of these affairs is with Irene Adler. After the affair, Milan, did retain a lot of political influence even after his abdication. He does go back to Serbia at one point during Alexander's reign. And the reason he eventually left for good was that both he and his wife opposed their son's marriage to Draga. And so he threw them both out, and Milan ultimately died in exile. As you saw eventually in the story, Irene Adler, even though of course she hated what had been done to her, must have retained a certain fondness for Milan, or she wouldn't have involved herself and Holmes in trying to save Alexander. And Milan actually appears in the previous Crowned Head story, The Inconvenient Heir Apparent, which is about Elizabeth and Rudolph as a character, and shows up a little better in this one than he, of course, he's not at all in Serbia, but certainly some of the things that are said about him are not very flattering. Okay, but now let's get to why Irene Adler was in the Balkans to begin with. And let's go on to the next slide, please, Derek. And here I can start spreading the blame because a lot of I'm not really the person who originated this. This originated with our old friend Baring Gould, who you may have remembered from my last presentation as coming up with the first wife for Dr. Watson. Also, later in Sherlock Holmes of Baker Street, he has Holmes and Adler meeting in Montenegro, where she had gone after Godfrey Norton died, and there they have a love affair, which is something that the canonical purists again are going to be furious about. Sherlock Holmes should not have sex, and but in the story, if you may remember reading a paragraph where Watson tries to explain that, and basically, the gist of it is that there had been a very strong intellectual attraction between the two of them. Holmes was on the run. He probably was as emotionally vulnerable as he ever was at any point during his life. And he had already realized that Irene Adler, if he had a perfect woman for himself, she would have been it, because she had not only beauty, charm, and a sympathetic nature, but a mind that matched his own. Now, they probably had a few things they had to get past when they met again, in terms of what had happened with the scandal in Bohemia case. But at least according to Baring Gould and David Markham, David is here today, so I appreciate his being here to support me, since I'm also drawing on what he said. But the three of us have all accepted this idea of the affair between Holmes and Irene Adler. And we can go ahead now, Derek. It actually gets even worse, because not only did they have an affair, but as you saw at the end of the story, they had actually had a son together. And Baring Gould came up with the theory, which David Markham accepts in his story that I've cited here, The Adventure of the Other Brother. And even Rex Stout did not deny that young Scott Adler Holmes, Holmes and Irene's son, grows up to be the detective Nero Wolfe, looking a lot more like his uncle Mycroft maybe than his father. But eventually, after some unfortunate, and I'm taking this from Rex Stout, not from Baring Gould, excuse me. After some unpleasant events in the First World War and afterward, Nero Wolfe flees, or not flees, but goes to America, and ultimately, of course, becomes a detective nearly as famous as his father. And even in my book, in the last Crowned Head story, the Welbeck Abbey shooting party, I refer to an incident that Rex Stout later brings out in one of his novels, where Nero Wolfe, as we'll call him now, carries out a diplomatic mission on behalf of Mycroft, but really for the Austrians during the Balkan Wars, and later comes to regret this very much, and actually fights for Montenegro in the war, according to Rex Stout. So there is this whole connection between Nero Wolfe, Irene Adler, and Holmes that Baring Gould started, that some of the rest of us have kind of taken and run with in our own writing. And to me, that kind of thing is a lot of fun, but we can discuss all of that and see what you think of it later on. I'll try to move on a little faster here, Derek. Let's go on, please. All right, now, so in A Scandal in Serbia, we have Irene living in Montenegro, the land of the Black Mountain, having married Count Vuksic, a Montenegrin nobleman, some years her senior. I really get annoyed with the way that Alamy and some of these other sites have taken over all these historical photographs, but since I use some of their stuff, I did cite them. And Marko Vukic, who is the Count's son by a previous marriage, becomes a friend of Nero Wolfe, since they more or less grew up together. And Marko is a character in a lot of the, or several at least, of the Rex Stout novels. And in The Black Mountain, Nero Wolfe actually returns to Montenegro to avenge his friend's murder. Just as kind of a sideline here, one of the nicest things about writing this book was all the interesting historical places and palaces and scenic sites that I got to write about and research. If any of you are particularly interested in that area, Rebecca West years ago wrote a book called Black Lamb and Gray Falcon that is a history of Yugoslavia that goes all the way back to the Dark Ages. Basically, she is very much pro-Serb and anti-Austrian and anti-Turk, so be ready for the prejudice. But she basically gives you a guided tour of the whole Adriatic area and some of these areas like the Boce de Cataro that I refer to in my story. It's a very beautiful area. I'm hoping to get over there sometime. Okay, Derek. Now, back to the elephant in the room, Sherlock Holmes having a sex life. I was not the first person to do this, and even Baring Gould did not do it. If you go all the way back to 1899, William Gillette, in one of his stage plays, wanted to have have Holmes get married, not to Irene Adler, but someone else. And when he asked Doyle for permission, Doyle said, "You may marry him, murder him, or do anything you like with him." So that might be one response to the canonical purist, because even Conan Doyle himself did not really seem to mind some of these variations that pastichers have come up with in later years, or biographers have come up with, where they give Holmes more of a private life than was ever mentioned in the canon. Okay. Next. Now, one other person who has written very heavily on this theme is a woman named A.S. Croyle, who has written a whole series of novels. This is the first one, When the Song of the Angels is Stilled, in which a young Sherlock Holmes, probably during the time that he is at Oxford, falls in love with Michael Stamford's sister, a young woman named Poppy, Priscilla, but called Poppy, who is a very modern thinking young Victorian woman who wants to become a doctor. They do have a very brief love affair, basically amounting to one night, but remain friends and detective partners through several cases. This first one involves not baby farms. I've forgotten the term I'm trying to use. Anyway, it's several detective cases, but ultimately Holmes decides that if he is going to be a detective, he needs to put aside feminine distractions and devote himself entirely to his vocation. In my way of thinking, this is a much more attractive and interesting motivation for Holmes' chastity than making him just psychologically a eunuch or a high functioning sociopath like Sherlock, or the recent iteration of Sherlock. So, because it does make it comprehensible. And that's the interpretation that I follow in my writing. And Craig Stephen Copeland, the novelist who is with us today, I believe, made that point also in his latest book, which I just read, where Holmes meets Mata Hari, who is certainly someone of legendary feminine wiles, and tells her, "Madam, a man must choose between being susceptible to the wiles of a woman or being a good detective." And ultimately, Holmes made that decision that he is going to be a detective rather than a lover. But let's go on again, please. That doesn't necessarily mean, according to me at least, that he is incapable of feeling. At one point in The Inconvenient Heir Apparent, I'm just going to read this because it kind of sums up my feelings, at least about Holmes' approach to emotion. "My Boswell, Watson, and his chronicles of my career too often depicted me as an emotionless reasoning machine. It is true that I regarded my personal feelings as a distraction to my work, and I tried to minimize their impact upon the science of deduction. Inevitably, this habitual suppression of emotion carried over to my private life. Readers of the Doctor's Tale should not conclude, however, that I am or ever was incapable of feeling. Sherlock Holmes is no automaton. The great detective must not be equated with the inner man. In other words, he has feelings like anyone else, but he suppressed them basically for the sake of his profession." And he does say, at least in my book, that he had experienced romantic love, and that would, of course, account for his affair with Irene Adler. And the thesis, I guess, of my writing is that if he had given up romantic love for the sake of his career as a young man, that on encountering the woman who was his feminine ideal, at a time when he was on the run and very vulnerable, at that point he gave way to normal human emotion, fell in love, had an affair, had a son, and then once he lost Irene in 1903, I guess reverted to putting all of that aside, because there's certainly no evidence, as far as I have read, at least in other people's work, that he fell in love with anyone after that time. But if we accept the fact that he was not incapable of feeling, then to me that makes a certain amount of sense. All right, almost done here. I'm sorry, I've run on a little long. Next slide, please. And again, this review that I had of A Scandal of Serbia, which, as you can see, has certainly stayed with me, thought that the whole idea of including these emotional episodes in Holmes' life is tampering with the canon. But I don't really see that necessarily as a bad thing. And as we've seen, even Conan Doyle didn't necessarily object to the idea of Holmes getting married. My idea with Conan Doyle is that most of the canonical stories were really primarily intended to demonstrate Holmes' facility for observation and deduction. And as we've all seen, there were instances where Doyle did get a little careless about the details of his character's lives outside of Baker Street. The whole episode or question of Dr. Watson's wives, how many, who they were, and all of that, which of course I've already gone into in another story, is only one instance, where there is some uncertainty among Sherlockians about what Conan Doyle really intended. All right, last slide. Again, I just want to spread the blame around here a little bit by mentioning some other authors who have taken this sort of tack. Marcia Wilson has done a lot for the Scotland Yarders. She is, as you see, an illustrator as well as an author, but her writing about Gregson, Bradstreet, and especially Lestrade and the other Scotland Yarders turns them from just foils of Sherlock Holmes into fully developed, fully realized human beings that have lives and families and backstories. And David, I'll mention you here. what David has done in some of his work, this story, The Adventure of the Other Brother, and then a lot of the writing he has done since then, is to trace the family connections between Sherlock Holmes and Nero Wolfe and Solar Ponds, two of his successors. And I've shown some of the books here that are involved with that. And then, as you know from my previous presentation, I and David and other, maybe some other people, Baron Gould, of course, at least mentions him, have gone back and written about Watson's first wife, Constance. She appears, at least in retrospect, in The Dying Emperor, which takes place shortly after her death. And now, of course, I'm writing about the Irene Adler heresy. So I guess I have to describe myself as an unrepentant Baron Gouldist, and I will now open things up to be attacked if that's what anyone wants to do, or at least continue the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tom. All right, so I'm sure we probably have quite a few questions for Tom. And just if you want to just unmute to ask your question, I think that's fine. Or if you want to make a comment, that's fine as well. Tom, you timed it really well. We have at least a good 15 minutes for discussion and questions.
Yeah.
Okay.
Can I be the first kid off the block? And ask Tom, what area did he specialize in his PhD in history?
My field was in modern Britain, which was everything since 1485, but my dissertation was actually written on defense policy in the last Salisbury administration. I did have kind of a minor field in modern Europe. Germany and Austria were two of the countries that I was very much interested in, and they are really the dominant countries that are involved in the Crown Heads plots.
Excellent, thank you very much.
Okay.
Well,
Yes.
well, it doesn't really, you don't, saying that Conan Doyle would have approved of this, didn't really care about Holmes' personal life, is not a good argument.
Well, okay.
He's just a literary agent. Who cares about him?
Okay.
It's the canon that's the sacred piece. But it's interesting that again, so many have written and accepted Baron Gould's take. If you ever saw a TV movie called Sherlock Holmes in New York.
Oh.
I think I must have missed that one.
Well, that was it had what's his name?
Roger Moore.
Roger Moore.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
But they take it, they go right from the Baron Gould story. They have Irene Adler showing up with his son.
Yeah.
And they take that in that movie very, very seriously. So it is you're not the first.
No, I'm not the first. And I didn't mean to imply that I was. I mean, a lot of people have done this. I mean, she even shows up at the end of Nicholas Meyer's first book, or movie, So it's a long-standing tradition, and that doesn't necessarily make it respectable for everybody, I guess. But as I say, I'm glad to spread the blame. Other questions?
Well,
Yes, ma'am.
it's more of a comment. I noticed that Tom Burns has said that maybe Holmes didn't want Watson to talk about his private life and made him allowed him to write the stories only under the condition that he kept private things private. And
Well,
if
I
that
think
is
that's
so, and
certainly-
it sounds very true to me,
Mhm.
then that explains why we don't know anything at all about whether he had affairs or didn't have affairs or what.
Right.
We just don't know because it's not in the stories.
Right. I think that's certainly true of the canonical stories. And the way I justified that is that Watson waited to write all of this. I mean, Holmes, of course, didn't, for many years, didn't give Watson permission to write anything. But it's only at the end of at least Watson's life that he did allow or Holmes did allow him to at least tell the truth about Irene Adler. And if you read the stories, Holmes actually writes part of the stories himself. That section I read, that long quotation, was actually something that he had written. Now, whether Holmes would actually have done that, again, I think that's just a matter of interpretation. But I certainly agree, that he would never have allowed Watson to do that earlier in their careers.
As it is, he complains that Watson is making the stories into something that, they're not simply an explanation of his detective style.
Right.
And as it is, he complains about that. So he certainly doesn't want anything more personal than Watson is showing, the little bits and pieces about putting a sandwich in his pocket. Well, that's getting a little personal. That's about as personal as Holmes will allow.
Yeah. Well, I can see that you don't agree with that approach.
No, I do agree. I
Uh-huh.
can see Holmes saying, look,
No, I meant with
I
mine.
think it's good to write these stories up. I would wish you would put more into the process and less into the exciting bits, but okay, but you keep my life out of this.
Okay. Okay.
Anna, I think you had a question next.
Yeah, actually more of a comment. I just want to say, Tom, I really like your writing style. I really enjoy your stories. I think you're an excellent writer. And I also wanted to say, I personally always thought of Holmes as rather asexual, but I recently was working with middle schoolers. I did a Sherlock Holmes club with them. And on the last day, I asked for impressions. And I had a girl raise her hand and she said, Sherlock Holmes is hot. So
You must have been watching Cumberbatch.
So you never know. All right. Well, thanks for sharing your story.
Thank you.
That one of the mysteries of the canon, I'm getting ready now to have a group meeting with my group on the Musgrave ritual. And one of the mysteries of the Musgrave ritual is there's a line in the Musgrave ritual that is not in some editions, but not in others. And it's the line what was the month, the 6th from the 1st.
That's right.
That comes and that goes. And I always thought that the reason that again, Holmes was so against, he would tell Watson, if you're gonna write a story about my early life, that's fine, but nothing in about my personal life. You can't have anything like that in there. And he thought that the 6th from the 1st might be a clue to his birthday, which is January 6th. And so that's why, so he was angry with Watson. So that's why Watson did manage to get that line out of some versions, some editions, but not others. So there's another version of the theory.
I think Shana, you're next, and then Craig.
Hi, Tom. I just wanted to say I'm pretty sure this is the first pastiche I've read which had Watson as a father. And I found that it was interesting, like that we actually get to see the impact that has on his relationship with Holmes and vice versa, his work with Holmes, the way it impacts his family. And the fact, like, I'm herring off, to Serbia. I can't keep doing this. I've got a wife and stepchildren.
Right.
Right.
Yeah, that's another of my, Watson's third wife, I have identified as the widow of an ex-Army officer, and actually the latest published story that I've written in part 27 of the anthology goes back into how they met, and really follows their whole marriage, much as I did with Constance and Ghost from Christmas Past. So, I don't think David really fully agrees with the idea of Watson having stepchildren either, but there are a million, maybe not literally, but quite a few candidates for Dr. Watson's third wife. And I wanted to tie it to his latest marriage to his military background. And that's what I've done with her. She shows up in a couple of the other Crown, or at least one of the other Crownhead stories as well.
All right, Craig.
Okay, Tom, I really appreciate the depth of your historical research. It's wonderful. So I'm going to move the questions away from canonical purity and all the rest of it back into history. Of
Okay.
all the events that took place between 1880 and 1914, it's an incredible time in Europe and around the world. Any reason why these particular 4 incidents captured your imagination? And are there others in your bailiwick in the pipeline that are coming from other events in history?
Well, yes. Oddly enough, I think I've always been interested in this particular period and this particular group of monarchs, as well as Nicholas II and some of the others back from my days in graduate school. The thing I think that kind of set this off was many years ago when I was working at the medical library at Vanderbilt. I got a hold of Morrill Mackenzie's book on Frederick III's last illness, which plays a big role in that story, and became very interested in him because he was such a different character, certainly a liberal thinking person. He married to the daughter of Queen Victoria, and it just struck me how different European history might have been if he had lived a little longer and all of that. So that was certainly a very significant transition from Frederick III to William. I wanted to, since I was writing, when I envisioned these stories, Rudolph and Elizabeth, the assassination or the deaths of those two, Rudolph's suicide and Elizabeth's assassination in Austria, really, I guess, probably ultimately were not that significant in bringing on the war, but certainly one person that I do blame very heavily for Austria-Hungary's demise was Franz Joseph, and he's always kind of a popular figure in among people who like that period, and everyone kind of feels sorry for him. But I don't like Franz Joseph, and I think he was a very poor ruler. And so, in the Inconvenient Heir Apparent, I kind of tried to show the effect that he had on Elizabeth and on Rudolph. And then Franz Ferdinand is another character who might have made a difference if he had survived to become emperor, because he was a reformer. He saw what needed to be done, or at least what might conceivably have saved the Austrian Empire. And of course, if Austria-Hungary had somehow survived, then a lot of, at least as far as the immediate causes of the war, it might have been postponed, or there might have been some progress without war. I don't know. It's very debatable, of course, but I think, as I say, that particular group of European rulers, and it just has always fascinated me. And by kind of uniting the stories through the idea of the pan-Germanists being behind some of these plots, that gave it a little bit of coherence that at least I hope it did, that it might not have otherwise had. Okay, sorry. Other questions? Okay.
I'll jump in. I try to let other people talk, but one of the things, and then I think honestly, David, Craig, Tom, both Toms, all of you could jump in on this one. Ray, you could probably as well too. But one of the things that's always a challenge of writing a Sherlock Holmes story is the research, and balancing out the time it takes to, even if you're writing a straightforward pastiche, you got to go back in time, and try to make sure you don't do anything historically inaccurate. And then for people like me as well, also try to keep those Americanisms out of it as best you can. I'm just wondering how long it usually takes you to write one of your stories, and how do you check it for accuracy?
Well, it takes, as David can testify, it takes me a lot longer than it should sometimes. I worked on this book off and on for about 5 years. Scandal in Serbia was originally published, I think, in the beginning of 2017. Probably in terms of actual research and writing, months at least on each story. And I hope there are. There is a bibliography included with the book. I start out sort of on Wikipedia sometimes, but some of the sources I was already familiar with. Some of the others I picked up along the way. And the worst thing, or the most difficult thing, I think, is try to avoid telling too much and to fit the historical background both accurately into the Sherlock Holmes element of the stories without the historical side just overwhelming things. And in the first version of The Case of the Dying Emperor, which was published as an ebook, there were 117 footnotes with that, or endnotes with that, which was about the same number of pages in the story in ebook form. And Daniel Victor, who is another Sherlockian friend of mine who had read the thing, said, you need to consider the idea of a historical essay, rather than all of these footnotes. So I did take that approach with the book, which I hope will make it a little easier to follow. But yeah, the research was long and arduous, and probably longer and more arduous than it needed to be. I don't intend to write anything quite this detailed again. I think Craig asked about future stories along this line that may come out. I do have a couple in mind, but they're going to be short story length rather than novel length. And so I don't think I'm going to go all the way back down this road again. Okay. Any other questions?
Yeah, any other questions or comments for Tom?
Let me look at the chat here and see if there's anything I've overlooked. Yeah. Yeah, it says, Ray has indicated Holmes had great difficulty persuading Watson to document the stories in the manner that Holmes would have preferred. Yes, I think that was an ongoing problem from the time Watson started writing, and not only for revealing too much information, but the whole idea of presenting them as stories rather than analysis of Holmes's deductive work. Okay, someone has a poor internet connection. Tom Burns, for me, 3 weeks to a month for an 8,000, yeah. For an 8,000 to 10,000 word story. Yeah, that's anything, I think that you're taking seriously, and particularly if it has a historical side, you need to try to be accurate. I do try to avoid errors and Americanisms, which I guess I'm sometimes guilty of, but I think not only as a Sherlockian or pasticher, but as a historian, accuracy is something that you need to try to strive for. All right, well, I'll shut up now.
Tom, thank you so much for a wonderful talk. Michael, did you want to get something in there? I thought it looked like you had unmuted.
No.
My mistake. All right, let's round up for Tom.
One thing you might, I think maybe the name of the group might be wrong. It maybe should be 5 miles from the cannon.
All right, let's give Tom a round of applause for a very wonderful, as always, talk. All right, let me share the screen one more time just to go into. Next month, we always, for the end of the year, we wrap up with a Christmas story. And so next month, we are going to do The Adventure of the Unique Dickensians, which is actually a Solar Pond story, and was featured in the book Sherlock Holmes, The Three-Pipe Christmas that Dan Andriaco put out last year. And the main reason I chose this one is I was just asked by Peter Blah and Tracy Heron to write an article for the August Derleth Society about my Ponds publications, and this would tie in with that. And I thought, well, I'll give a little talk about the story next time, but I'll probably also invite other people who know Ponds to jump in and maybe make it more of a panel discussion. next time. So that's where we're going for December. I really hope I see everybody there. And thank you all for coming. So thank you, and I look forward to the December meeting. So Tom, again, we appreciate your talk, and I think it'll be a nice way to wrap up the year next month too. Okay, take care, everyone.
Well done, leader.
All right, thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.